The scenes were idyllic, the crimes horrific. In the years of 1969 and 1970, the areas surrounding San Francisco had a dark shadow cast upon them. A deranged, sadistic killer was on the loose. He targeted couples, spending time together, forgetting worries of the world, and lovers, making memories of which he would twist into nightmares of his own. His victims, he killed at gunpoint or stabbed. They were attacked with knives, all the while the police were left to chase a ghost. To this day, there are many suspects, but the killer has never been caught and possibly remains at large. Valuing himself as some sort of twisted artist, he wrote letters to newspapers, making threats and plans for what he had in store next, continually taunting the San Francisco Police Department, keeping score of his kills. He is known for his brutal attacks, strange cryptograms, and a white symbol of a circle in the crosshairs. He has gone by only one name and will be forever remembered that way in history. This is Chapter 19 of the Insidious Agenda Podcast, and a story we're going to call Dear Editor, this is the Zodiac speaking. Thanks for tuning in. I'm glad you found your way back for a new true crime episode of the Insidious Agenda Podcast. As always, I'm Nick, your host for this week's story. On this week's story, we're going to dive into the dark, twisted killing spree of the man known as the Zodiac Killer. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss out on any of my weekly episodes. Now get comfortable and let your heart start beating just a little bit faster, knowing that the Zodiac is still out there somewhere. Now let's go back to the 1960s and attempt to survive our encounter with the Zodiac. The story of the Zodiac begins with his first victim. On Monday, the 30th of December in 1968, a young teenaged couple from Hogan High School in the town of Villisca, California, had plans to attend their school's Christmas concert that evening. These two teenagers, about to embark on their first date, were Betty Lou Jensen and David Arthur Faraday. Their plan was to attend the concert, which was only 3 blocks away from where Jensen lived. As soon as they set out the door, these plans changed. The pair paid a visit to a friend before heading to a local restaurant. After having dinner, they departed for an area that was considered Lover's Lane, known as Lake Herman Road. The road wasn't very well traveled. It didn't see a lot of traffic. There were also no lights in the vicinity, so it was extremely dark. Needless to say, lightless and secluded, a perfect area for Lover's Lane. The majority of people heading down that road was only ever local teenagers from the high schools, well, at that hour of the evening anyway. The road was in the town of Villisca, a town of only about 5,000 people and considered a middle-class community with almost no crime. The town had a relatively clean record, as before the incident we're about to get to, they hadn't seen a very serious crime in the years preceding it. It's believed that sometime around 10:15, the old Rambler carrying Faraday and Jensen pulled into the road's turnabout and was parked. A little while later, around 11 p.m., the car was set upon by a local woman named Stella Borges. Stella would unfortunately find the dead bodies of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen. When the call of a 1187 on Lake Herman Road came in, the police were soon dispatched to the scene. When they arrived, they would immediately notice the first body, David Faraday, lying on the ground, his head sitting in a pool of his own blood. He suffered from a gunshot wound just above his left ear. It was a bitterly cold night, but David's body was still found to be breathing. It was highly likely that his respiratory system was slowed due to the cold. The first unit immediately cordoned off the scene, with another unit from the town of Benicia. The body of the second victim, Betty Lou Jensen, was discovered 28 feet away from the car, with 5 gunshot wounds in her back. Betty was found with vital signs absent, having bled out from the gunshot wounds inflicted upon her. Trying to piece together a sequence of events, the police were able to discern that the killer had arrived in another vehicle sometime before 11. He got out of his vehicle and walked over to where the teenagers were parked. It's believed that he ordered them to get out of the vehicle. The police thought that Betty Lou was ordered to get out first. When David followed, the killer shot him in the head. Scared for her life, Betty Lou ran from the vehicle and was shot in the back while running away. At some point during this ordeal, the killer fired 2 rounds into the car. The first into the rear passenger side window and another into the frame of the car. These were believed to be warning shots, threats to deal with non-compliance, and were a way to scare the teenagers out of the car. The police were on scene until about 4 a.m., marking off the bodies and collecting whatever evidence they could. The nearby towns of Benicia and Vallejo were left to wonder if that was the only event or if there was a crazed killer on the loose. One of the more frightening parts of the case is that there appeared to be no motive for the killer to do what they did. Some of those who investigated the case at the time believe now that had they possessed a lot of the practice, procedure, and forensic technology that exists today, they would have more than likely been able to catch the killer. The next time the killer would strike was in Blue Rock Springs, a rural town near Vallejo, and about 6 kilometers from the site of Faraday and Jensen's murders on Lake Herman Road just 6 months prior. It was a nice rural area that was loved by people that were local. Families would hold barbecues and picnics on the weekend, so it possessed a lovely family-style atmosphere. It was also, like Lake Herman Road, described as a lover's lane for that area. In the evening, the police received a call about a gunshot victim and would investigate. The call came from a young teenage girl who told operator Nancy Slovis that there were kids being shot at. The call was put out that shots were fired. Sometime before midnight on Independence Day, the 4th of July, in 1969, 22-year-old Darlene Farron and 19-year-old Michael McGough were parked in Blue Rock Springs Park. Shortly after they arrived, another vehicle entered the park and came up alongside their vehicle. It lingered only a moment and then sped off almost as soon as it arrived. About 10 minutes later, the same vehicle returned, this time pulling in behind McGough's vehicle. The driver got out and walked over to where Farron and McGough were parked. He pointed a flashlight into the window so he could see their eyes. and as soon as they looked at him, he fired off 5 rounds from his 9mm Luger pistol. The shots connected. Magot was riddled with bullets, and some of those that hit him passed through him and hit Farron. The assailant intended to leave right away, but when he heard the pained moaning of Magot, the killer returned and put another 2 bullets into each victim, returned to his car, and drove away. Only a few hours later, a call would come into the Vallejo Police Department. It was from a man who took credit for the attack on the 2 teenagers. He told the police that if you go just 1 mile east to the park, you will find a double murder. Adding to this, he also told them it was I who killed Jensen and Faraday. He was described as speaking very monotone and appeared as though he had either rehearsed the speech or was reading a script that he had written. There was no emotion in his voice. When asked what his name was for the emergency notification, the caller didn't respond to it, only letting the call taker know that they would find the kids in a brown car, shot with a 9mm Luger. When he was coming to the end of his call, his voice changed. When it came time to say goodbye, he said it as though it were goodbye. The call taker, Nancy Slovis, described it as though it were evil and one of the worst things that she has ever heard. Through a trace, the police were able to figure out that the call was placed from a phone booth at a Union 76 gas station on Springs Road in Tulum, which was only a few blocks away from the Vallejo Police Department. The 2 kids were taken to the hospital where Darlene Farron was pronounced dead on arrival. When she was found at the car, she was barely coherent and unable to answer to anything the police asked her. Michael Magot survived the attack even after suffering gunshots to his face, neck, and chest. The police were able to recover Darlene's purse and Michael's wallet from the vehicle, so they were able to be easily identified. When Magot was able to speak with the police, he described the attacker as being around 26 to 30 years of age, around 200 pounds and standing about 5 foot 8 inches with short, brown curly hair. He was a relatively nondescript guy. Magot informed the police that whomever it was had been chasing them all night. He had followed the couple from the restaurant they were eating at, and Magot was forced to pull off into the park to get away. That was when the previous sequence of events unfolded. Magot couldn't confirm whether the car that was chasing them was the same car that pulled up near them. An interesting thing that Magot brought forward was he asked Darlene if she knew the person in the car, to which she told him not to mind it. When the car pulled up the second time, she told him that it was someone who was just jealous and not to worry about it. He remembered her referring to the person as being named Richard and that he had a bad temper. She told Michael that Richard would kill her if he ever found out she was with him. The killer would next make his presence known on the 1st of August in 1969. 3 letters that had been written by the killer were delivered to the Vallejo Times-Herald, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the San Francisco Examiner newspapers. The letters, which were determined to be near identical, were described as written by someone who suffered from isolation. In the contents of the letters, the killer confirmed taking of credit for the murders of both sets of teenagers on Lake Herman Road and in Blue Rock Springs Park. Perhaps more peculiar was that each letter contained 1/3 of a 408 symbol cryptogram. The significance of this is that the killer claimed his name was in the complete document. With these letters also came a threat. If the ciphers were not printed on the front page of each newspaper, then the killer was going to cruise around all weekend, killing lone people in the night, and then move on to kill again until I end up with 12 people over the weekend. The only newspaper to print the cryptogram in their paper was the San Francisco Chronicle, publishing it on page 4 rather than the front page that the killer had asked for. There wasn't initially a lot of support for the letters being from the killer, and the Vallejo Police Department were not satisfied that the letter was written by him. Chief Jack Stilts made a request to the killer that the writer send a second letter with more facts that would prove that it was truly him. The second letter came as requested. The San Francisco Examiner received that letter on the 7th of August in 1969. It was in the first line of this letter that the killer would finally give his name. Dear editor, this is the Zodiac speaking. This was the first time the killer actually identified Zodiac as his name. The letter contained various details about both murders that had not yet been made public. It also stated that the killer would be found once the police cracked the code of the cryptogram. The following day, after the entire cipher was published, a couple from Salinas, California, named Donald and Betty Harden, were able to crack it. The cryptogram, deciphered, would read the following: I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest, because man is the most dangerous animal of all. To kill something gives me the most thrilling experience. It is even better than getting your rocks off with a girl. The best part of it is that when I die, I will be reborn in paradise, and all that I have killed will become my slaves. I will not give you my name, because you will try to slow down or stop my collecting of slaves for my afterlife. There was also a final word in the killer's cryptogram, the last word that could not be deciphered. The Zodiac's letter ended up not revealing his actual name. It made reference to the novel The Most Dangerous Game by Richard Connell, and did outline his desire to collect slaves for his afterlife, which he believed would take place in paradise. Another key element in the second letter was borrowed from Alfred Hitchcock's museum piece. One of the central plot points in that book was the idea of a light at the end of a gun, similar to what the Zodiac was doing during his murders, blinding victims with a flashlight before shooting them. The Zodiac's next attack took place on the 27th of September in 1969. Two Pacific Union college students named Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were having a picnic on a small island at Lake Berryessa. The island was connected to the mainland by way of a small sand spit. They had laid out a blanket over the island, being the only inhabitants save for 3 oak trees. The couple were enjoying their picnic when Cecilia noticed something and appeared distracted. They were approached by a white man who was described as 5 foot 11 inches tall, who weighed a bit more than 170 pounds. He was wearing a black, medieval executioner-style hood over his head, with clip-on sunglasses to cover the holes in the mask. He also had a bib-like piece of clothing covering his chest. On it was a symbol, a 3-inch by 3-inch white circle with a cross in the middle that broke the bounds of that circle. In his hand, he held what was believed to be a Colt .45 pistol. The man claimed to be an escaped convict from a prison that was either in Colorado or Montana that Hartnell would later recall as having two names. The police would later infer that he was referencing a jail in Deer Lodge, Montana. The man's story was that he killed a guard and stole a car. His purpose for stopping was that he needed the couple's car and every bit of money they had to make his escape to Mexico. Even though he had them at gunpoint, he assured them there was nothing to be afraid of. If everyone remains cool, no one would get hurt. Hartnell was cautious about the man, and he knew he was a killer, as he had informed them that he killed that guard in Montana. Hartnell later said he laughed originally, as he only had 75 cents in his pocket, but said that if he needed help, then he could get him some help. Hartnell told the man what he was doing in school, and he could help the man, but there was nothing he wanted other than money. What he needed at that time was to get Brian tied up. Brian thought that if the man got close enough, he could wrestle the gun from him, but the distance would have been too much to overcome. Brian described the man's voice as being very slow and methodic, a voice he would be able to recognize if he heard it again. The man had brought with him different pre-cut lengths of plastic clothesline. He gave directions to Cecilia to tie up her boyfriend before the man would tie her up. The man had to adjust the restraints, as Shepard had tied them way too loosely. The killer then, as he said he would, tied up Cecilia. The couple were hog-tied, with both feet and hands roped up, with the tie connecting the two. Brian asked if the gun was really loaded, which the killer confirmed it was, and then holstered the weapon. Brian and Cecilia believed this to be a sort of bizarre robbery until the man drew a knife and stabbed them both repeatedly. Brian only saw the flash of the knife before it was lodged in his back. As Brian was attacked first, Cecilia was forced to watch, terrified and screaming for the man to stop, for she knew she was next. When he turned to attack Cecilia, she was thrashing about and moving. Brian couldn't bear to watch. He had a sinking feeling she was going to die. Brian decided to remain motionless, for fear of being attacked again if he was found moving. When his rampage was done, Hartnell had suffered 6 stab wounds, while Shepard endured 10. The assailant then left the couple, hiking about half a kilometer back to their car, where he would carve into the passenger's door a message. The top was adorned with the circle cross symbol, followed by Vallejo 12 20 68 7 4 69 September 27 69 6:30 by knife. Reporting the crime himself, the killer called into the Napa County Sheriff's Office, yet again from a payphone. His first words were, "I want to report a murder. No, a double murder. They're 2 miles north of the park and in a white Carmen Gia." He revealed that he was the perpetrator of the crime, filled them in on the details, and left, with the phone still hanging off the hook. The phone was found only minutes later at the Napa car wash on Main Street by a radio reporter named Pat Stanley. Again, the call came from within only a few blocks of the sheriff's office, but was approximately 43 kilometers from the scene of the crime. The victims were found by a local man and his son who were fishing nearby. They heard the couple's screams, discovered them, and requested help from the park rangers. Hartnell was able to, with Cecilia's help, get free of his restraints and crawl and walk back to the road. He was found by a man in a heavy coat with a flashlight, which he feared was their attacker returning, but quickly noticed he had an official badge and knew the ranger station was just up the road. The man from the boat had gone to the ranger station and alerted them of what they saw. Sheriff's deputies named David Collins and Ray Land were the first to arrive at the scene. Cecilia was still conscious when they arrived and was able to provide a description of their attacker. The couple were then rushed to the Queen of the Valley Hospital by ambulance. Shepard would slip into a coma during the rush to the hospital and never regained consciousness. She would pass away only 2 days later. Hartnell was able to be saved and survived the whole ordeal. He told his story to the press for the world to hear. The investigation of this case was assigned to Ken Narlow, who worked on it from that date until his retirement in 1987. During the entire ordeal, it was revealed by Brian Hartnell that the killer never revealed himself or referred to himself as the Zodiac. Only 2 weeks after the attacks on Hartnell and Shepard, the Zodiac would strike again on the 11th of October. That evening, a white male passenger hired a cab that was driven by Paul Stein. He got into the cab at the intersection of Mason and Geary Streets. His request was to be driven to the corner of Washington and Maple, in an area known as Presidio Heights. It's still unknown why, but Stein drove exactly 1 block past that destination, and when the vehicle came to a stop, he was shot only once in the back of the head. The killer took Stein's wallet and keys and left the scene. His escape was witnessed by 3 teenagers around 9:55 p.m., and they subsequently called the police. Their description of events was that they witnessed the killer wipe down the vehicle before he left. He walked away from the scene toward the Presidio, approximately 1 block away. 2 police officers who were heading to the call observed a white man who was walking down the sidewalk before walking to a stairway leading into the yard of one of the houses. One bystander estimated that the man was between 35 and 45, who was about 5'10" in height and had a crew cut. The teenagers would describe him as 25 to 35, confirm that he had a crew cut, but was about 5'8" or 9. This was roughly the same description that Magot had given only a few months prior. The police dispatcher said that they should be on the lookout for a black suspect, which is why the 2 officers responding to the call didn't think much of the white male they saw leaving the scene. It's still unknown as to why the information was passed on with the wrong description of the assailant. A search of the area was conducted, but no suspect was located. It should be noted that Paul Stein's death was the last confirmed kill by the Zodiac. The police chalked the killing up to a routine robbery gone wrong, and that the robbery had escalated into homicide. This would all change, as on the 13th of October, the San Francisco Chronicle received a letter from the Zodiac which claimed credit for the killing. He sent the letter with a piece of Stein's shirt covered in blood, which proved that it was him. The witnesses and an artist were able to produce a composite sketch of the Zodiac a few days later. His letter would also contain a threat to the police, as he talked about killing children on a school bus. Just shoot out the front tire, and then pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out. A few days later, on October 20th, a man claiming to be the Zodiac called the Oakland Police Department around 2 p.m. He demanded that one of 2 lawyers, Lee Bailey or Marvin Belly, appear on the talk show AM San Francisco. Bailey was not available, but Belly did attend the studio. Jim Dunbar, the host, asked all viewers to keep the phone lines open. Someone who claimed to be the Zodiac called several times. Belly asked him to use a less ominous name, so the killer opted for the moniker Sam. The killer did not want to reveal his identity, for fear of being sent to the gas chamber, as capital punishment was legal in California. Belly arranged to meet the caller outside a shop in Daly City, but the caller never arrived. The call was traced to a patient in a mental institution, and it was concluded that it was not the Zodiac in the end. On the 9th of November, the Zodiac mailed a 7-page letter which stated he had talked to 2 police officers only 3 minutes after he killed Stein. Parts of the letter were published in the Chronicle on the 12th of November. This left the police department scrambling, with Officer Don Fook writing a memo explaining the evening's events that day. 1 year after the murders of Faraday and Jensen, the Zodiac sent a letter to the lawyer Marvin Belly with another piece of Stein's shirt, asking Belly for help. Many other victims, across the span of a decade, are believed to be attributed to the Zodiac, although aren't outrightly proven, as he had never taken credit for them. There was the murder of cab driver Ray Davis in April of 1962. A day before the murder, the Oceanside PD received a call stating that, "I am going to pull something here in Oceanside, and you'll never be able to figure it out." A few days after the murder, another call came in from the same person who outlined details of the murder and said that he would next be murdering a bus driver. In 1963, a young couple from Santa Barbara County was murdered. Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards, his fiancée, were gunned down on a beach in Lompoc after taking part in their high school's senior ditch day. The assailant attempted to tie up the victims, but they were able to free themselves and escape when they were shot many times in the back with a .22 caliber weapon. The killer then moved their bodies to a nearby shed and attempted, but failed, to light the shed on fire. In 1966, Sherry Jo Bates was stabbed to death and borderline decapitated at her college in Riverside. The killer would write a letter stating, "She had to die. There will be more." 4 years later, Chronicle reporter Paul Avery received a tip regarding similarities between Bates's death and the Zodiac. 5 months after this, Avery received a letter applauding the police for discovering "my Riverside activity, but they are only finding the easy ones. There are a hell of a lot more down there." In March of 1970, Kathleen Johns was abducted in an area near Modesto. She was able to escape the confines of a car whose driver took her and her infant daughter for about 1.5 hours. In a more higher-profile murder, there are possibly links to the Zodiac in the JonBenet Ramsey murder case. On the night she died, Ramsey told a neighbor she was going to meet Santa Claus that night, and she was later murdered. The key similarity was that the Zodiac was known to wear a disguise, so it's quite possible he did it. If this was ever proven to be the case, the Zodiac's murder spree would have spanned decades. Throughout 1970, authorities continued to receive many more letters, as well as some greeting cards. On a letter from April 20th, the person wrote, "My name is," and then a blank line, followed by a 13-character cipher, which still has not been solved. His letter outlined that he was not responsible for the bombing of a police station in San Francisco from the 18th of February in 1970, but did state that there is more glory to killing a cop than a civ, because a cop can shoot back. The letter bore the symbol of the Zodiac and included a diagram of a bomb he planned to use to blow up a school bus. At the bottom of the letter he wrote, "Zodiac 10, San Francisco Police Department, 0. Many more letters would come in the months that followed, some talking about shooting victims, others how he planned to torture his slaves. Each had an update on the score between he and the SFPD, and many more things. On the 27th of October, Paul Avery received a Halloween card signed with the letter Z. Inside was written, "Peekaboo, you are doomed." This card found its way onto the front page of the Chronicle. Because of this, Avery began receiving information of similarities surrounding the Zodiac's activities and the murder of Sherry Jo Bates. The Zodiac case then became dormant, remaining silent for a period of about 3 years. In the letter, which was postmarked for the 29th of January 1974, the Zodiac praised The Exorcist for being the best satirical comedy he had ever seen. This letter bore an unusual symbol at the bottom and outlined one final score. Me, 37, SFPD, 0. In 1976, Belly described an encounter between himself, undercover police, and a Riverside law student that claimed he was the Zodiac killer. When they met, Belly was unconvinced and let the police know they were investigating the wrong man. This, of course, was an engineered encounter meant to sell copies of the book. Even in 2022, author Robert Graysmith outlined that the possibility of the Zodiac was a former student of Pacific High School. This would make it entirely possible that Richard, that Darlene Ferrin knew, may point closely to who the Zodiac may have been. There have been various attempts to figure out who the identity of the killer is, but as of the writing of this episode, the identity still remains unsolved. The case of the Zodiac killer still remains open to this day in both Napa County and the city of Riverside. With the case as high profile as the Zodiac, there are a long list of suspects who have been labeled as the killer. The first, and the most highly suspicious, is that of Arthur Lee Allen. Allen was brought in for questioning many times during the earlier parts of the Zodiac's rampage. He had been the subject of many search warrants over a period of 20 years. He was believed to have been the most likely suspect. However, all of the evidence that was brought against him turned out to be negative. Law enforcement officer Dave Toschi, who interviewed Allen, always believed it was him, although he never had the evidence to prove it. At this time, a lot of police officers trusted their gut instinct. Toschi even said, "As soon as the guy walked in the door, I knew it was him." Unfortunately, with nothing to pin on Allen, he had to investigate every possible lead he had. Allen was discovered to have been in the vicinity of Lake Berryessa when the attack against Hartnell and Shepherd had taken place in September of '69. Allen confirmed that he was scuba diving on the day of the attacks. In 1971, Allen's friend Donald Cheney reported him to the police, stating that Allen had been talking about his desire to kill people, his use of the name Zodiac, and the fact that he secured a flashlight to his arm every night so that he could see in the dark. Allen had also previously served with the U.S. Navy, but received a dishonorable discharge in 1958 and had also been fired from his job as an elementary school teacher in 1968 after allegations surfaced of sexual misconduct. He was well regarded at the school, but had a penchant for being fixated on small children and would get angry at women. In 1972, the police executed a search warrant for Allen's residence, and in 1974, he pled guilty and served 2 years imprisonment for sexually assaulting a 12-year-old boy. 2 days after Allen's death in 1992, Vallejo police executed another search warrant on his residence and ended up seizing some of his property. In July of '92, Mike Mago had identified Allen as his assailant during a photo lineup. He said, "That's him. That's the man who shot me." Nancy Slovis, who took the call from the Zodiac after that shooting, said that his voice didn't match the caller's that night. Other evidence presented about Allen has been purely circumstantial. Take, for example, that he owned a Zodiac brand wristwatch. DNA was also taken from the back of some of the stamps of the letters, however never resulted in a match. Some of the other interesting similarities between Alan and the Zodiac are that he was thought to be a friend of Darlene Farron's sister Linda and a best friend to Darlene. He admitted to possessing bloody knives in his car during the same weekend as the late Berryessa attack, claiming it had come from a chicken he killed for dinner. He was serving a jail sentence during the Zodiac's 1971-74 hiatus, but the hiatus did start before Alan went to prison. Evidence against naming him was that his fingerprints and handwriting didn't match that of the Zodiac, and that's what cleared him. There were many other suspects in the case as well. Joseph Bevilacqua, Jack Terrence, Richard Gaikowski, Lawrence Kane, Richard Marshall, Lewis Myers, Robert Nichols, and Ross Sullivan, just to name some. Each of these men having their own motivations that could have possibly made them into the Zodiac. Some, even with striking, curious similarities to the Zodiac attacks. Even more high-profile killers, like Ted Bundy, Edward Edwards, Ted Kaczynski, and Charles Manson had been suggested, but were of course eventually eliminated as suspects. In truth, we'll never know who the Zodiac Killer was. His killing rampage in 1969 and 1970 leaves a lot up to the imagination. From descriptions of the survivors, he dressed in black clothing and was known to have, at least once, worn a hood adorned with the Zodiac symbol. Sometimes, he would dispatch his victims with a gun, believed to be a 9mm Luger. Other times, he would use a military-style knife. He targeted Caucasian teenage couples while they were in secluded areas. His methods of approach varied, sometimes speaking with the victims, other times saying nothing at all. The attacks appeared to begin as robberies before taking much darker and worse turns. The Zodiac also had a penchant for attacking in areas where police jurisdictions overlapped, which created some confusion in the process in order to slow the investigations of authorities. In his book, The Cases That Haunt Us, John Douglas said the Zodiac was profiled as being a narcissist and a paranoid social misfit, a loner. He was driven by the need for attention, power, and most of all desired credibility. He had a strong desire to prove he was intellectually superior in order to compensate for inadequacy and inferiority. He was obsessed with his victims underestimating him. Douglas believed that he spent the majority of his life with his mother, whom he did not have a best relationship with. This would lead to a failure of success with women, but that he may have had some kind of relation to victims at Riverside College. He didn't last in the military due to a failure to subscribe to a routine-based environment, but did have a passion for dealing with weapons. He may have been a hunter or had some technical expertise demonstrated by his affection for puzzles. In his letters, he appeared highly organized and well-educated, which contradicted sloppiness at times, leaving behind minor bits of evidence at the crime scenes. Douglas believed that he stopped after his luck was running out, and he may have been spotted or interrogated, like the time after he was talked to by police after the Stein murder. The possibility can also not be excluded that he committed suicide. From the letter sent to Belly, it can be inferred that he suffered from depression and would have eventually committed suicide. This is especially seen around Christmas time, a general time of togetherness when he killed some of his first victims. The legacy of the Zodiac has spawned copycats like Eddie Seda and Sato Sakibara, claiming to have been inspired by the killings of the Zodiac. In closing, if he was assumed to be around 30 in 1969, that would put him at approximately 83 years old in 2022. As no name has ever truly been attached to the Zodiac, it is possible that he's still out there somewhere today. It's possible that he could be long gone or dead until another letter shows up reading, "Dear Editor, this is the Zodiac." If you're hearing this message, that means you made it to the end of our episode, surviving an encounter with the Zodiac Killer. I really hope you enjoyed this week's episode and had as much of a good time listening as I had making it for you. For more information about the podcast, please visit our Linktree and our social media links in the show notes. Before you go, remember to hit the subscribe button so you can find your way back next week and don't miss a single episode. And remember to come back next Tuesday for an episode about the abductions of Betty and Barney Hill, the first alien abductions in human history. New episodes release every Tuesday at 5 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. But for now, it's time to close the cover of the Insidious Agenda. I'll see you again next week.